Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. New ideas and analysis with Dr. Cameron Murray and Jonathan Gadir. G'day, Cameron.
Hey, Jonathan. How have you been?
I've been, I'm all right now, but I had the Rona. I had COVID.
You've had it now.
Yeah. Now I'm good. Now I'm fine.
Well, that's not good to hear, but it's nice that you've bounced back and ready to record this podcast together.
Straight to the Barney of the week then. What's your Barney?
Well, I think since you recently recovered from COVID, I think this week's Barney should be about COVID and the crazy arguments I've had, for example, with John Quiggin at UQ, a professor who's blocked me on Twitter for pointing out some of the crazier things that him and many others have been saying about how we should organize our society because of COVID. So
it's quite amusing that an academic does, blocks another academic. Aren't you supposed to be able to just have arguments and just be cool with it?
Look, I'm not saying I'm blameless here. I've certainly prodded him, and I'm sure there were thousands of others there as well. And I think it's good for his his personal well-being to block generously on social media. But
so you were kind of being annoying, were you? You just kind of like,
oh look,
what about that?
Just retweeting the crazy things he would say. For example, in January, I actually had COVID in January, and my whole family had COVID, and we bounced back pretty quick. And at the time, Quiggin was talking online about the return to university of in-person instruction and railing about the lack of masks and needing 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 vaccinations for every student, lest they risk the lives of their professors by attending the campus, which made no sense, of course, because if you'd followed the data, young people like healthy university students in their 20s are tiny risks for COVID, many thousands of times less risky than in the elderly. And of course, if you're a university academic, it's in many ways your choice to show up to that environment. Not, you should be looking after your health and letting the tens of thousands of students look after their health based on their risks. So I found it really bizarre the way he went on and on about sort of controlling the lives of the students for the benefits of the academics, when I think the risks were completely in the wrong ballpark. And even now, many people today are still going on about COVID and how we must do something, despite the Shanghai lockdowns, despite the fact that we did already lock down for 2 years and we still have COVID today. Somehow there's just this residual anxiety or panic that won't go away. And I do worry this winter whether any Australian governments might find it advantageous to sort of nurture that panic.
So John Quiggin's tweeted something from Crikey about 6,000 Australians having died from COVID this year. I think his point being, is this really living with it, with all these people dying? It's about how the country's marginalised and more likely to die from COVID. Do you have a sort of a take on this? Was this part of your Barney?
Yeah, look, this is part of the same argument, is that yes, everybody dies from something at some point. We see huge seasonal deaths every year in the winter from colds and flus and other things that are the final straw for many of the elderly. So the question really is not, are a lot of people dying, because 160,000 people die in Australia every year. The question is are 7,000 people dying with COVID instead of with something else at a similar point in their life, while is it better that that happens, or the whole of society is shut down indefinitely? And that's the trade-off. And I just don't think, um, for an economist, he's really thinking about the trade-offs. And I've written about
But
this
is
many.
that fair? Is he saying the trade-off's shutting down society, or is it that we should all wear masks and be forced to be vaccinated? Is that the trade-off?
But that's not the trade-off. That's the thing. All the evidence, we have been masked. Everybody is vaccinated, and now we have COVID deaths. So just because you want something to be true, or you want to feel like you're doing something, doesn't mean you should do that thing or it's effective. We are the most vaccinated. Do we remember when we said the way out of this is vaccination? We got to just keep punishing people till we get more vaccinations, and then we'll be free. Do you remember that last year? Were you in the?
Yeah,
I know
yeah, I
my
remember.
Victorian friends remember, and so now we're there. We did it. We did exactly what they said, and this is the outcome. And now, for some reason, despite the evidence, we are still, well, many people are still saying, well, we've got to do what China did, maybe, or we've got to wear masks indefinitely, even though now the CDC, for example, says, oh, cloth masks don't really do anything at all. Maybe surgical masks are slightly better, but we still don't really even know. What kind of policy approach is that? Would you like your doctors to do surgery on you when they're like, oh, we don't really know if this will work or not? We've tried it and it never worked before, but we're still going to give it to you because we think it's the right thing to do. You would never, you would never go, yeah, please cut me open now. Let's do this. Yet when we take a step back and think about the collective and this policy, for some reason, that sort of evidence flies, or the lack of evidence flies. So I don't know what John is doing. I feel like maybe he's dug himself a hole. I know many people have dug themselves a hole, but what I have found interesting this year is I've had quite a few people contact me and apologize for having a go at me when, for example, I was on Q&A last year and I said, we don't need to vaccinate children. The risk of the virus is much lower than you think. We should be getting on with our lives. Obviously, I was a granny killer. Social media went nuts. My university, who had talked up my appearance on Q&A, suddenly went quiet. And people who, had a go at me then have since come out and said, you're right. Like, clearly nothing that we've done has worked. We should have just got on with life.
Oh, well, good on them for,
So
just being able to admit that,
it is great. It's great to see that most people, or your average person, is pretty good, I think, at weighing up the evidence they see before them. So
and John, if you're listening, unblock Cameron and let's have more proper debate on all this stuff.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so let's get to our meaty topic of substance for discussion today on Fresh Economic Thinking. What are we doing today?
We're going to do food waste and waste in general, and our attitude to. I think in New South Wales they've just banned plastic bags. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the next step of the plastic bag banning, the small ones that non-supermarket stores give out, which I'm okay with, even though it's inconvenient. I think we need to, and all this, we need to get moving on this, and the plastic cutlery and all that. It's inconvenient, but yeah, I think it's one of those things that, unlike some other environmental measures, seems to have a real benefit.
I was very keen on a lot of these environmental policy tweaks, these little tweaks that seem like they're going to provide quite direct, large benefits. And I am a big fan of direct policy intervention. If you want, for example, to preserve wildlife habitats, you don't tell people, oh, please stop eating this, or drive less, or wear hemp clothes instead of cotton, or whatever the case may be that you think has some kind of indirect effect of land use. You just draw a line on a map and make a rule that says inside this area it's wildlife habitat. I like those direct things. So the plastic bag ban, the plastic straw ban, feel to me in my gut like some kind of direct benefit. But the question I have is, what environmental problem are we solving? Do you know what this is about? Is it about littering and plastic bags in the ocean? Is that the justification?
Yeah.
Because I know for the straws, you've seen the pictures of turtles with straws stuck in their nose, or birds
Well,
with.
yeah, and also like isn't it like now quite well studied that even like every living thing, including us, like we've got like microparticles of plastics throughout our organs because and like just the exponential growth in this stuff is absolutely unsustainable, like in terms of the toxicity um and
Yeah.
the destruction of animals and
So I
environment.
guess
Yeah.
the way I approach this is to ask, is this a big effect? So we can sort of see, yeah, there'd be an effect, fewer plastic bags. If everybody put their plastic bags in the bin and their plastic straws in the bin, and we put them all in landfill and they were contained, then we wouldn't have to ban them. Do we agree with that? Do you think? That makes sense to me.
No.
Why? Well, really? Why?
Why does it matter why if they're in a bin or not?
Well, if you've put all your plastic bags in a landfill and covered it in, surely that's a good place for plastic to go where animals won't end up digesting it, and nor humans. Is that not a
Mm,
good solution?
I don't know. It assumes that, like, well, I guess in theory, if the landfill is perfectly safe, but like landfills are not, like they leak and they get into waterways, and
Yeah.
they're not this perfect sort of solution that is self-contained and not connected to the rest of soil and water.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and that's why we don't like putting oils and things like that in, and heavy metals in landfills. I guess the way I see it is, if you want to talk about waste management, you've got to have a cohesive view of what waste is and what's good or bad.
Uh-huh.
And so, if landfill is bad, the question is, well, every object we produce has a fixed lifetime of its use. All your clothes, all your furniture, your buildings, you name it, it has a fixed lifetime. And after that fixed lifetime, it's waste, it's rubbish. So every object humanity has ever produced has become waste at some
Yeah.
point. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the question is, well, if we want less waste, we should maybe produce fewer objects. And that's sort of, one of my intuitive ideas is maybe we're overproducing, and we are sacrificing, for example, leisure time for work time. And the thing that we do with that is we buy goods and services rather than enjoy social interactions.
Yeah.
So maybe that's true. But the point is, if everything you produce in ever is going to be waste, then how can it be a problem? Everything you've produced is good. It was there for a good reason. So I think you need to be a bit more clear about when is waste a problem and when is it not. I think that's the
Okay.
question. So for the plastic bags, okay, if plastic bags are in the ocean, that seems like a problem to me. If plastic bags are in a landfill that's reasonably well lined, and things aren't just blowing off the top of it into the creeks, then I think that's a good place for it. And so banning the plastic bags, yeah, maybe there's fewer plastic bags, so fewer end up in the creeks and rivers. But also it's the case that better waste management and essentially keeping our cities tidier so that stuff doesn't wash down off the streets and people don't leave litter, that also has the same effect, in my view. But it's not, we used to have that, Clean Up Australia Day, the anti-litter campaigns, all that sort of stuff. To me, that's the same effect. But I think at the end of the day, you have to accept that everything we make is waste, and we need to be comfortable with what we're doing with it, what's good and what's bad. And for me, digging a big hole and putting materials in it is a good solution. And it took me a while, to be honest, to come around to that view that digging a big hole and putting things in it is good, that recycling might be good, might not be, sort of depends on the relative value of the materials. So yeah, the plastic bag ban is a weird one for me, because you've got to think also that plastic bags are a useful thing. If we don't use plastic bags, what are we going to do? Well, we can use those. What's the alternative one you get at Coles and Woolworths? That woven.
Yeah, those biodegradable ones. Yeah. Oh, those woven ones. Yeah.
Yeah. They're much more resource intensive to make. They also need to be disposed of somewhere. They're more likely, obviously, to be in landfill than not. So I'm more comfortable with that. But yeah, I think the issue is a lot more subtle than banning plastic bags solves some pollution. Just have a think about the floods, for example, in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales recently. The amount of waste and debris that got washed into our oceans there is probably orders of magnitude larger than centuries worth of the effect of a plastic bag ban in terms of stopping rubbish getting into the oceans. So the question then is, well, we've devoted all this effort and hype to banning plastic bags. What about heavy rain? How do we stop stuff getting into the rivers? Are there direct ways we can? I know in Brisbane there are trials of nets on drains to scoop up rubbish that gets washed down.
So let's talk a bit about food waste, because there is a lot of kind of virtue signaling, if you want to call it that, about how terrible it is that we waste so much food. And sort of on a human level, if you see a supermarket throwing out heaps of food and then you've got homeless people on the street nearby, it is irrational, and it's kind of like one of those very visceral points at which the irrationality of capitalism is visible. As in, you've got stuff, but it's just not a feasible thing for it to just be given to the people who need it, because that's not how our system works. But I think you've got a slightly different take on waste, and I've read you writing that food waste is good to have food waste. It's sort of it's a positive sign. Talk me through that.
Yeah. So the interesting link to that plastic bags and packaging waste is that the packaging industry does two things. It markets the product, but it also preserves the product. And so there is a trade-off that if you want more food preserved and more better efficient use of the food that you grow, you need more packaging and hence more waste, packaging waste, which is, I think, under-acknowledged. But in terms of overall food waste, there's a real big push. I don't know if you've seen the ads in Brisbane. We have a billboard campaign about food waste is worse than flying for the environment, for greenhouse gas emissions, and there's many campaigns like that. But the catch is that you need a buffer of food production. You need to produce much more food than you consume in a year. So that implies that there's going to be food waste. Either crops are going to be plowed back in on the farm, at distribution steps there's going to be food waste, and after the retailing of food there'll be waste in the home. After you have dinner, you throw out your scraps, or your leftovers go bad, you throw it out, and at the supermarket. So at all those steps, you need a buffer, you need some waste. And why do I say that? Think of a world with zero food waste. Okay, so every berry, nut, grain, or animal produced or farmed is eaten by humans. And then imagine there is a flood and it wipes out a decent proportion of food production. In that world, the number of calories consumed by humans goes down exactly by the amount that the food production goes down. There is no buffer. So if we are eating a couple of thousand calories a day and that year's food production goes down 25%, well, 25% fewer calories, and how those are distributed amongst the population, yeah, it's going to be proportionate to your wealth and power. So it's terrible. It's terrible for poor people. We had societies like that in the past where, you know, you lived off the land and you ate everything you got, and starvation was real. So you've got to think about food waste as a buffer stock. And there is no way to avoid it. We can't insure for it. We can't just take out an insurance policy and say, hey, if there's no food this year, can you pay me cash? Because there's no food. You can't buy any with the cash, right? So that's my point, is that I used to also be very concerned about waste and food waste, and I used to buy into this, and it's great that we can find productive uses for waste. We can compost it. We can, I compost things. We give scraps to the dog. We try and do useful things with food waste, but sometimes you can't. I used to do dumpster diving. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So
people that were involved with me at the permaculture garden at UNSW, some of them were into that.
So I used to go to the supermarket dumpster at night when it was all closed and go and get the food and the items that they'd throw out. And we had an Aldi near us, which was especially good because they'd throw out those Aldi specials in the middle. So you'd end up with random, I got steel cap boots and baby clothes and, random things for the garden. And it was amazing. But at the end of the day, it was still actually very difficult to make use of those things. It was difficult for Aldi, so they threw it out because it wasn't worth them. It wasn't worth them trying to distribute it to another store to sell those non-perishable products. And the food, it's also very hard to eat, 10 kilos of cabbages or whatever the case may be with you and your neighbors in a very timely manner. So we found that we ended up throwing a lot of the stuff out ourselves. And so that makes you question, well, they threw it out. We think they're wasteful and we're being really great. We get a few things, but at the end of the day, we kind of throw it out or give it away, or, maybe they were right that at that point, that was the most appropriate thing to do with those items. So yeah, that's the lesson there, is that, sometimes you just can't do it, and it's good. If you want lots of choice and options in your food supply system, you're going to have to be wasteful. And maybe we'll talk about it another day, but I've always said the great thing about capitalism is how wasteful it is, how many options we have to do different things. It's not because it's efficient, it's because it's robust. It gives us variety and options.
What people are upset about when it comes to food waste, I think, because you're talking about effectively surplus. Yeah, you're saying it's great to have surplus. The immoral thing that people are pointing to when they talk about food waste is they're pointing to the immoral way that it's not that surplus is not distributed to people that have a real human need for it. And the other immoral thing people are pointing to is that that we're producing stuff that doesn't meet human needs. It's going to produce things that rich people like to pay for. I don't know, you're being a little bit kind of deliberately contrarian in kind of ignoring that's what people mean when they talk about
look, there's still so there's two issues. One's the aggregate production, and that's my argument, that in aggregate, regardless of the distribution, you need this surplus food, and you're going to have to waste half the food you produce. In terms of the distribution, this is always just a question of providing money to people who don't have it, who can buy food because we have so much surplus food. That is the question. And if you're worried about the international inequality, then we should lobby for policies that essentially give money to poor countries. We should give them free tractors and machines. We should pay for people to go over and work there to accelerate their production of food, and we should give the poor in those countries money. Because the question is not how do the leftover foods from supermarkets in Sydney or Brisbane get to poor people in the Philippines or Indonesia or the Pacific Islands? Because that's just not going to happen. That food is not going to get on a plane and go there. The answer to
I'm not talking about exports. I'm just talking about the food that they have. I just used Philippines as an example because there's heaps of extremely poor people who sometimes go hungry, and they have heaps of food there in the Philippines. I'm not talking about exports to.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's the point. This is a distributional question. If those people weren't poor, they would buy food in priority to other goods and services if they had the money, and then therefore they would have plenty of food because there is enough food to go around.
What do you think of the idea that there are certain things that are human rights that just should be taken out of the market? Like it's not a matter of, with food, it's not a matter of how much money you have. We just guarantee that everyone gets a certain basic, amount of stuff.
Yeah, look, in principle, I like that idea. I like it with healthcare because you can essentially allocate healthcare by need quite easily, but food is a kind of a different story, and the use of money to allocate different types of food at different times to different people seems like really useful to me. I'm still an economist, and I still think pricing and markets and letting people choose has power. And I think because there is so much surplus food around on the planet, that just redistributing the purchasing power would automatically solve that. It would give you that right to food because you would have a right to anything up to some certain amount of income. It would be food, clothing, shelter, anything that you could buy. So I don't want to see, rationing where everybody gets a right to a kilogram of cheese and a block of this, like wartime rations for food. I think that's somewhat ineffective. And even when those systems are used, they end up with a voucher system that looks a lot like money at the end of the day. So yeah, I get the feeling that it should be a right, and that seeing all this food waste while some people go hungry looks like it's an issue with capitalism somehow. But every other ism that's ever existed had a lot of inequality and hunger as well. And I think the trick is to think politically about how we redistribute to make sure everyone's got a minimum income, not just for food, but for shelter and clothing and all other types of things as well.
That's good. Food for thought. And next time, more puns coming your way on Fresh Economic Thinking. Thank you very much, Cameron. Look forward to our next chat. Keep the Barneys going.
Great to talk again. See you, Jonathan.